Imagine sitting in stillness, perhaps in meditation, perhaps in grief, perhaps while under the influence of a mind-altering substance. And suddenly, the internal narration, the voice you've always assumed was you, goes quiet. There's no one directing attention, no one reacting, no one calculating. Only awareness, raw, unfiltered. A vastness without boundary or story. You see, the ego is not just a feeling. It's the organizing principle of your sense of self. It tells you that you're separate from others, that you have a name, a role, a past, that this is your face in the mirror, that those are your beliefs, your emotions, your goals. It doesn't need to be loud to function. It often hums just beneath the surface like the OS of your mind. And it works, most of the time. It helps you navigate social roles. It protects you from chaos. It interprets every experience through the lens of you. But then something breaks. And it's not just a bad day. It's not a mood. It's not confusion. It's a rupture. You no longer are the one doing the thinking. You are simply here. This ego death isn't a metaphor. It's a visceral moment. And when it happens, it feels like dying. Because in a sense, it is. But here's the twist. When the ego dies, something else remains. And that something has no name. Ego death can be terrifying, but it's also profoundly liberating. Because it reveals something most people never see. The ego is not who you are. It's a structure, a tool, a mask, a habit of identity. In this expanded journey, we will not just flirt with the idea. We will dive into the many dimensions of ego and its dissolution. We'll explore how psychology constructs the ego through developmental stages and inner conflicts. We'll look at Jung's archetypal self and the shadows that threaten the ego's control. We'll visit Eastern traditions that speak of the ego as illusion, as a false center. We'll walk through brain science, the default mode network, ego boundaries, and how psychedelics reveal the architecture of identity by pulling it apart. We'll explore the inner alchemy of rebirth, of integration, of how ego death, if it is not resisted, can become a gateway to something more luminous, something closer to soul. And we'll ask, is ego death the destination, or simply the threshold? Because there's danger here too. Not every disintegration leads to healing. Not every awakening is stable. The path from death to rebirth is not linear, and not all who walk it return intact. But some do, and they return changed. They return softer, slower, more spacious. They speak not from fear, but from presence, not from identity, but from being. Let's begin this exploration not with answers, but with questions. What part of you clings to control? What part fears its own erasure? What might remain if you let go of your story? The ego does not die easily. It resists, it screams. It calls ego death a kind of insanity, and in some ways it is. It is the loss of structure, of self-narrative, of ego control. But if the ego is a container, what if there is something greater that wants to pour through? Stay with that, because we're just beginning. To understand what dissolves, we must understand what was built. The ego isn't just a nebulous sense of self. It's a sophisticated psychological construct assembled over time, like scaffolding on a cathedral that we eventually mistake for the building itself. Let's begin with Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. Though many of his ideas have evolved or been challenged, Freud offered us the first formal blueprint for the ego. He proposed a tripartite mind, the ID, driven by instinct and desire, the superego, internalized rules and ideals, and in between, the ego, the mediator. It is the ego that says yes or no, based on what reality allows. It tries to balance primal urges with social expectations. In Freud's view, the ego isn't a villain, it's a manager, but it's also fragile. Its job is nearly impossible, to maintain identity in the face of competing demands from within and without. Carl Jung, Freud's once protege turned philosophical rebel, expanded this vision. Jung saw the ego as a center of consciousness, but not the whole psyche. Beneath it lay the personal unconscious, full of repressed memories and forgotten potentials, and beneath that, the collective unconscious, an ancestral sea of myth, dream, and archetype. For Jung, the ego was like a small boat navigating an enormous ocean. His goal wasn't ego death per se, but ego integration, the process he called individuation. The ego, he believed, should expand to embrace the shadow, to reconcile the tension between opposites, and to serve a greater whole. The self with a capital S. But even Jung acknowledged that this process often felt like death. The old ego, rigid and defended, had to break. It had to confront the dark, the irrational, the mystical. Only through surrender could it be reformed. And yet, long before Freud or Jung, spiritual traditions were already charting this inner terrain. In Buddhism, the ego is a misidentification. What we take as a permanent self is actually a series of impermanent processes, thoughts, sensations, emotions, all conditioned, all fleeting. The teaching of anatta, or no self, invites practitioners to examine the illusion of identity until it falls apart. In Hinduism, the ego is known as ahamkara, literally I-maker. It's the false center that mistakes itself for the eternal. The goal is to realize Atman, the true self, which is not personal but universal. To see past the veil of ego is to see that you are not a wave but the ocean itself. In Sufism, the ego, nafs, is the lower self, the part driven by fear, pride, and desire. The mystic's task is to tame it, not by force, but by love. Through devotion and remembrance, the ego softens, it bends, it eventually bows to something higher. What's remarkable is how modern neuroscience is beginning to echo these ancient insights. When researchers studied brains under the influence of psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, ayahuasca, they noticed something fascinating. The default mode network, DMN, a set of brain regions active during self-referential thought, goes quiet. The usual mental chatter, the me narrative, dissolves. This phenomenon mirrors the subjective report of ego death. People say things like, "I vanished," "There was no me," or "I became everything." Brain scans confirm. Under these substances, the rigid patterns of ego activity disintegrate. Connectivity increases across previously unlinked brain regions. The mind becomes more globally integrated, less compartmentalized, and it doesn't only happen under drugs. Advanced meditation practitioners show similar patterns. When the ego relaxes, awareness remains, but without its usual anchor. Time becomes fluid, boundaries blur, the self becomes porous. This has profound implications. It suggests that the ego is not the seat of consciousness. It's a filter, a lens. It structures the world, but it's not the world. When it steps aside, something vast can be perceived. But that perception is not always comfortable. For many, it's disorienting, even terrifying. The ego interprets its dissolution as death, and in a way, it is, not of the body, but of the identity. And yet, something remains, something that watches, that sees, that simply is. And that something, perhaps, is closer to what we've always called the soul. Ego death, if you survive it, isn't just disappearance, it's descent. And like all descents, it follows the arc of myth, of ritual, of transformation. In mythology, descent into the underworld is a recurring motif. Think of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess, stripped of her garments as she passes through the 7 gates of the underworld. Think of Orpheus, descending to retrieve Eurydice, of Jesus entering the tomb, of Buddha facing Mara under the Bodhi tree. The ego death experience mirrors this ancient journey. Something must be stripped away. An old self must be confronted, and often it is terrifying. Why? Because the ego is the part of us that clings, that organizes, that plans and protects. It doesn't want to surrender. It doesn't want to die. Even when suffering has become unbearable, the ego resists release, because identity, even painful identity, feels safer than the unknown. But death is not optional on this path. In spiritual initiation, in mystical experience, in trauma recovery, there often comes a moment where the old story can no longer hold. The mask cracks. The center collapses. The scaffolding of identity breaks down. And yet, in that breaking, space is made. This is the heart of alchemical transformation, the sacred formula of solve et coagula, dissolve and reform. The ego must be deconstructed so that something new, more integrated, more authentic, can emerge. This process isn't clean. It's not always pretty. It often looks like crisis, like disorientation, like madness. It may involve months or years of unlearning, of grieving, of integration, but eventually, if nurtured with care, the new self takes shape. This is not the same as ego resurrection. This is ego realignment. The reborn ego no longer claims supremacy. It no longer pretends to be the whole. It becomes a servant, not a master. Jung called this individuation, a return to wholeness. Not by eliminating the ego, but by placing it in right relation to the greater self. In this new configuration, the ego functions without dominating. It speaks without drowning out the soul. It lives in the world, but no longer forgets the mystery beyond it. And from here, something extraordinary becomes possible, the embodiment of soul. This is not a floating, dissociated spirituality. It's a grounded presence, a person who has seen through the illusion but still shows up at work, in relationships, in the world, with gentleness, humility, and depth. It's a kind of walking silence, a person who carries stillness in their eyes, who no longer needs to prove anything because they've met the part of themselves that can't be threatened. And that, perhaps, is the true rebirth. Not a return to who you were, but the emergence of who you truly are. Let us now go beyond theory, beyond even the breaking. Let's speak of what it means to live after ego death. Not in the moment of collapse, but in the quiet that follows. In the stillness that settles when the storm has passed. Because if the ego is the narrator and the soul is the witness, then what happens when we begin living not from the story, but from the witnessing itself? Most people never ask that question. Most people never have to. Life doesn't demand that kind of depth. The world is more than happy for you to stay in the story, play the role, buy the product, follow the path. But something inside you is asking, something deeper. You've tasted silence, or at least you're drawn to it. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, but fills your being. The kind that isn't empty, but radiant. You've glimpsed what it means to not be your thoughts, to not be your fears, to not be your habits of reaction. And now, you are invited to live from that place. This is where soul begins, not as belief, but as presence. The soul doesn't argue. It doesn't compete. It doesn't try to convince. It sees. It listens. It loves. It breathes. Living from soul doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean you never fall back into ego patterns. It means that even when you do, you know it. You see it. And that awareness, that space, is everything. You can speak, but you know you are not your words. You can feel pain, but you know you are not the pain. You can experience fear, but you are no longer afraid of the fear. And this shift, subtle but seismic, is what marks the rebirth. Not a new ego, not a spiritual identity, but a being who is finally at home in the mystery. This is the quiet power of post-ego living. A person who has seen behind the curtain doesn't need to prove anything. They don't need to win arguments. They don't need to grasp. They've tasted something bigger. And even if the ego returns, as it always does, there's now an awareness beneath it that can hold it gently. Imagine a life led by that awareness. A relationship where you listen more than you defend. A career where your value is not tied to your output. A solitude that doesn't feel lonely because you are accompanied by presence itself. This is not an escape. It's a return to what you've always been, before the name, before the trauma, before the masks. You are not here to destroy the ego. You are here to see it, to love it, to gently unhook from it, and to rest in the quiet behind it. The soul is not another character in your story. It's the space in which the story unfolds. And when you begin to live from that space, even ordinary life becomes sacred. Doing the dishes becomes a meditation. Walking down the street becomes a prayer. Looking into someone's eyes becomes an act of communion. Because you are no longer performing. You are being, fully, quietly, presently. And from that presence, everything changes. You can grieve and still feel whole. You can fail and still feel worthy. You can let go and still remain. This is not because you've become superhuman. It's because you've stopped confusing yourself with the mask. The mask can tear, but you are still here. The roles can shift, but you remain. The identity can collapse, and yet, awareness remains. Always. So, what is soul rebirth? It is not a new label. It is not a spiritual persona. It is not enlightenment, capital E. It is this moment right now, when you feel the breath in your chest and remember that you are not the thoughts swirling around it. It is the moment when the narrator grows quiet and something listens. It is the steady, silent knowing that you are already what you were seeking. So we return to the original question: ego death or soul rebirth? The answer, of course, is both. You cannot be reborn without surrender. You cannot awaken without dissolving. You cannot embody soul without letting ego step aside. But once it does, what a life awaits you. Not free from pain, not without difficulty, but finally, true. A life lived from the inside out, a soul remembering itself. Next time on the Syntax of the Soul series, we explore the inner voice, who's speaking. Until then, stay curious, stay conscious. If this stirred something inside you, subscribe, like, and share this with a fellow seeker.